Hey everyone, welcome to our opening session of this run of the Gauntlet Reading Club, hosted here on the Gauntlet. The Gauntlet, for folks who don't know, is an online gaming group devoted mostly to role-playing games of the Indian OSR variety. Besides hosting several different podcasts and a regular zine, the Codex. The Gauntlet also hosts an online gaming calendar that this was organized through. The calendar is open to anyone who is interested. So if you are interested in ever playing with any of the folks here or anyone else on the Gauntlet, they're all really cool and you should come over and try it out. This is a particular experiment that was actually originated by our David over here, in which we basically all agree to read a book together. We're going to do a little discussion about it this session, and we'll use it to inform the kind of collective world building and help inspire some of that in our and help inspire our play and following sessions. We're not just going to be trying to like recreate plot points from the book, but we that would be a bit. We've read the book, so why do we just need to retell that plot? But we will be using it to sort of kind of give us a shared jumping point. And I think, David, you were inspired by the kind of Star Wars Saturdays, right? And the way that has managed to run for, I think, multiple years at this point.
Yeah, definitely.
And so, yeah, this particular run, we are going to be reading CosmoKnights by, well, discussing it. We have read it by Hannah Templar. And we'll be following that up with a run of Thirsty Sword Lesbians designed by April Kit Walsh. So we'll do a quick round of introductions here. I am Stephen, he, him, and I'm the person who will be GMing the Thirsty Sword Lesbians run. I'll be facilitating this discussion group. But yeah, and I guess if you also want to just say if you want to give your first impression of the book as we go around, CosmoKnights was something I had a lot of fun with. It's why I brought it in. It was one of a couple different books that I was thinking about for Thirsty Sword Lesbians. The other got a bit darker, so I thought this would be a good first entry to open the reading group up on. But yeah, if we want to go around clockwise, if you want to David.
Yeah, hi, I'm David. I use he, him pronouns. Yeah, no, I really enjoyed CosmoKnights. It's I sort of like the premise. I really enjoy the sort of the art style on it. That I think I really like the way it looks, like the way it's drawn, and I think it's got some really cool stuff in there, which I'm sure we'll get into in a little bit later. But yeah, I enjoyed it, certainly.
And I'm Lyra. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns. And yeah, I also really enjoyed it. I was also going to flag up the art style in particular. Kind of particularly I'm sure there's a term for it in graphic novels, but the full page art spreads were just gorgeous in this, and just the kind of the color, the sense of color there as well. Like I also really enjoyed the kind of themes and the construction of it, in particular I'm sure we'll get into this, but the kind of breadth of gender presentation, of gender expression in there, kind of like just, and I kind of love the fact that it failed. I think it, as far as I can tell, it fails a reverse Bechdel test, which I enjoyed, because that kind of, there's so much media that fails the standard Bechdel test. It's nice to have one that fails a reverse Bechdel test. So
Yeah. But yeah, that was actually one of my first thoughts of like, because for me, what I guess stood out for me in CosmoKnights in reading through it for a second time for this group was like, as both of you brought up, were really the art of the book. It struck me as like as this kind of really interesting throwback to like kind of the French like kind of sci-fi comics of like the 70s, where there was this kind of, what's the word, excess to the pages. Like the full page spreads were often these kind of excessive, like splayed out splays of detail. And I thought that it was interesting that even though a lot of the characters in this first plot line, like this was really in the end of the characters, kind of a very cast heavy plot line, where I felt like you got a lot of access to her interiority and her like history. I still felt like all the characters were really present in my mind as people, just because of how much detail went into each of their designs. I mean, Rose in particular, who I have to say is practically one of the sexiest characters in any comic I've read.
Yeah, that last spread of Welcome to the Resistance is just, oh, that's so good.
Yes, and oh, did you have something? Did you have any thoughts, David?
Yes, sorry, I was just caught between tabs. Yeah, the I think as well for me, I think the thing that I really got from, just again in a very general sense, the art style, I really like that kind of retro futuristic, or I suppose like multiply retro futuristic like look to everything, because you've obviously got like, I mean, just the central theming of where you've got these like kind of big knights dueling and jousting in like kind of, you know, Gundam / medieval mechs. They've got that big thing going on, but also the way that like the world, especially the world we sort of focus on at the beginning, which I'm going to continue to forget the names of off the top of my head. Is it Green? Is it Green Veil, or is it? Yeah, that's it. Where it looks like, you know, the 1950s in America kind of thing. It's got that real kind of, you know, diners and yeah, you know, it's got that very sort of 1950s look, or again, possibly retro 1980s, looking back to the 1950s.
It's kind of like, that's actually what I was going to say. It has that like the 1950s town as it's dying in the 1980s look.
yeah, exactly. And then you get up into space, and it's all that, like, again, it's like neon, and, you know, in that very, like, again, very like not what we would project as being futuristic from the modern day, but, you know, that kind of, yeah, you know, I mean, it's not Blade Runner, because it's not quite that grubby, I don't think, but it's that kind of, yeah, very like neon and yeah, you know, that sort of look to it. And I think it's interesting that, yeah, I think I really like that kind of juxtaposition of these, like, because it does kind of ground it, I think, in a way that like it feels like both, and again, that's, you know, we'll get to that, I'm sure, but the kind of ties, I think, in with that whole, like, the idea of being kind of like futuristic but also regressive at the same time. I think that comes out really well in the art as well as it does in like the very obvious like themes and stuff.
Yeah, and yeah, that was something that also was interesting to me, because there is this you bring up grounding, that there is this kind of And I think that in reading some of the opening pages of the second volume, there's this kind of break between how the economic realities of this world inform a lot of the characters' perspectives in the story. And I realize we haven't really described what this book is for folks who might be listening. CosmoKnights is a comic series by Hannah Templar. It mostly focuses on a group of, in a kind of, it's sort of a retro, like medieval, like sci-fi world where you have sort of advanced technology and spaceships, but it seems to be ruled by this kind of regressive aristocracy that that often like places their daughters up as prizes in these jousts, which are really sort of this very convoluted kind of spectacular way of arranging political marriages between worlds. Because no one really fights, none of the aristocracy fights in jousts anymore. They hire other people, knights, to fight for them, which is kind of an interesting point of reference here. But it tells the story of a group of women who are actually freeing princesses rather than secretly freeing princesses rather than winning their hands in marriage. And there is stuff that will emerge from there, but that is basically the foundation for what we're talking about here. Because but go on the subject of economic realities, because it is sort of interesting to me that like Cass and B get along a lot in this comic, but in the first few pages, there's already some disagreement about how they should react to Kate's offer. Because Cass kind of just wants to go on being the warrior ex-princess, and whereas B, who actually has lived outside of the aristocracy and being this on the run like jousting match, is more interested by Kate's offer and working with her. But there is this kind of that Cass is very much, even though she's resistant and doesn't fit into this model of femininity, she's still very much raised within this upper tier of wealth that none of the other characters were ever a part of.
Yeah. Do you want to? I realised I might have interrupted you might still be in your introduction, or are we back into discussion?
Yeah, we're back into discussion. Sorry,
cool.
I was jumping back in there, and I thought I'd open that out to folks.
Yeah, yeah. The kind of class and wealth issues are really interesting because they're all. I feel like they're in the background, and even like if this world is as kind of neo-feudalist as it's presented, then you don't, in spite of that, you don't really see much kind of real poverty in there. And I don't know whether that's because it doesn't exist or because the characters that we see aren't really kind of interacting with that. And I found that interesting, and I kind of, I can't decide whether it's something that I kind of like, I wanted to see more acknowledgement of kind of that there's, in spite of the rebellious nature of these characters, they're still kind of fairly privileged. Like they have a spaceship, like they're doing quite well for themselves in a number of ways. Or whether that not being acknowledged is kind of like the point, is kind of one of the commentaries on it, is that I feel that's something which might come out more in the second book, basically, and I'll be interested to see whether it does.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. And I mean, it also touched on like some of the stuff around kind of gender and stuff, which probably get into in a minute. I think is quite interesting. But yeah, I think particularly it's quite, because obviously we start off with this like very obvious like kind of class divide between. Sorry, I'm going to be terrible with names throughout because I never pick them up. But the between sorry, I'm going to see.
Tara and Pan, are you thinking of?
Yeah. Because obviously, you start off with these scenes in like kind of the, sneaking into the big house with, fries and all of this, and there's sort of like the juxtaposition that's put between those two characters. But then obviously we find out that sort of a protagonist, like her parents are a doctor and a small business owner. They're not like in poverty. They're just not the aristocracy sort of thing.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like that's the kind of the there's no real deprivation. There's no real anything like that in their background. It's just that. And then we also then compare, because like we talk, because obviously when you get then to the point where you're dealing with the sort of the whole knights and the jousting stuff, it's an interesting thing, I think, at that point, the split, because it's obvious that like the majority of the people, and obviously it's like it's on the one hand you can say, oh yeah, Cass has the more like noble thing, because she's going into these fights just to free these people from their the situation they've been put to, free these princesses. But like she has access to her like mobile suit, whatever they get called, and then I don't think they've been given a name yet, have they? But anyway, her like big robot that she fights in, because it's owned by her family and she nicked it, whereas all of the other people who are currently fighting in these jousts are doing it for the money. It's a job, it's something they're paid for. And I think that's quite an interesting juxtaposition as well, because this isn't like a world they're interacting with because they believe it's their divine right, because they are all nobility, but it's just something they do because it's a good way of making money for them, presumably, again, to the very limited level that we've had any sort of discussion on that at the moment. But that's from the outside what it's, that kind of classic kind of conflation between like fame and money kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see whether it's the case that there isn't deprivation in this world, or whether it's just that whether there's a lack of freedom without there being deprivation, or whether there is deprivation and we just haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, I feel like... Oh, go ahead.
No, I was done.
Okay. Yeah, because I do feel like there was one... like there was really only one page in the volume where I felt like they acknowledged there is actually like deprivation in this world. And let me just kind of bring it up here. Like, yeah, I feel like there is, if we that in like the last panel that we kind of see that the wider kind of economic landscape of Viridian seems to be one where everyone is out of work, and Pan's parents really might be some of the few actual businesses that are still providing services, one might say. Like, it seems like everything in Viridian is either in the process of going out of business or is out of work. So there is this kind, and and at least the people, it's why Pan at least is so disliked on Viridian, because people blame her for this economic depression that they are like positing. It's because you didn't, it's because you like helped the princess run off and you didn't marry us to like an economic partner.
Yeah, that's I kind of forgotten about that that panel. But yeah, that's yeah. It's really interesting, kind of in like reflection with our kind of own real world today, kind of like the presence of like this sort of economic reality with the high technology, because I feel like we're kind of getting into that world today. Like, I mean, one of the most essential items if you're unhoused is a smartphone, and like you have to have that to interact with the world in a lot of ways that are helpful to you. And but that's a piece of high technology which would be an unimaginable luxury like a few decades ago. So kind of like the shape of deprivation is kind of changing at the moment, and I think this is a really kind of like interesting reflection on kind of like how deprivation and high technology kind of exist together.
Well, let me see if I can get some video for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going anywhere in particular with that. I'm just.
I mean, no. I think that's something that's interesting to me, because it is like there are these kind of hints at like, but they're like, I was thinking of these technologies that are even more advanced than like, because the moment we enter into the like arena of like the VIP rooms, you have this whole like reveal that these favors are actually like some of the most advanced tech there is, and are just so and like they're just so advanced that they can't actually operate even outside of like these like infrastructure of like the palaces and the estates and whatnot, which is interesting. And also, if we're thinking about it, creates an interesting way of playing into what it might mean to parlay with the toxic powers. But there are these infrastructures of technology that one has to go to the nobility to actually secure.
Yeah, there's kind of a very iconic image of that on I've forgotten the name of the planet where Pan sneaks into the noble zone while and the kind of first meets Kate Rose. But whatever planet it is, the kind of the arena kind of just literally kind of hovering above this kind of huge circle, kind of like hovering above the kind of day-to-day life down on the planet. That's really striking.
Yeah, and I wanted to check in with you, David. Did you have any thoughts?
No, not particularly, not further on what's already been said. But yeah, I think it's right. I think that is interesting, like you mentioned, with the idea, like within the game of Thirsty Sword Lesbians, the idea of like part of the mechanics in that are about, you know, to what extent or that you still kind of interact with the yeah, I said the toxic powers, the powers that be sort of thing. I think, yeah, that is definitely something that we see in this. And even, like I said, going back to the idea of like the suit that Cass uses essentially being part of her family's birthright and all of that. That, yeah, you know, she wouldn't be able to use it if she weren't coming from that background where, or it would, you know, might be more difficult for her to get her hands on that equipment if she weren't coming from a position where she already had access to it, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's different ways to get access to that sort of thing. There's the legitimate sanctioned way that Cass has access to it, although obviously kind of stealing isn't part of the kind of sanctioned thing. But like there's that way through the nobility, and there's also the way that B represents, which is kind of through the underworld, through kind of hacking and smuggling and having connections that are kind of underneath the main structure of power, but can still get you things, like someone who can procure you the materials and help you build a suit like Bees. I've forgotten Javier. That's her knight name.
Yeah, and on the subject of the suits and the jousts, this was something I think Lyra, you brought up earlier in the conversation about the kind of play of gender, and it was sort of an interesting point to me of kind of, I mean, I think other characters as well, but in particular kind of Cass's relationship with gender representation, because of course she seems to like, it seems that like that like when she is actually like competing, she competes under male pronouns and often kind of goes between almost this very, particularly when she and B are dating when she's younger, kind of goes between these high mask like looks and back and forth, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, sorry, go on, David.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, yeah, I think it's interesting, and I mean, you know, obviously, like her night name is Bull. It's a very and works on those like assumptions of masculinity, and they refer a lot, I know, to like the the games as being like shows of like machismo and all of this, and I think it's really interesting, both the way that it's like kind of, I guess at the same time, both like, I think for me, to put it that way, what's interesting about it is it's obvious that like it isn't a requirement per se that people participating in the games are male, because B competes in them as a woman, and you can argue that like her. Again, I keep wanting to say mobile suit. I don't think they've actually called them anything yet. I could be.
We can just call them mobile suit. They're as good as anything.
Yeah, exactly. Is more like feminine, I guess, in appearance. It's like agile and slim and flies around.
Yeah, it's like angelic.
Exactly. And I think that's interesting. But like, there is this idea of the whole machismo of the things, and it's seen in that way. It's like got that kind of, you know, sports feel to it and all of this. But I think and obviously it reinforces the whole fact that the supposed point of this is winning the hand of the princess in combat, you know, in classical medieval joust style and all that. But I think what is interesting as well, on top of all of that, is that it is like the whole setup is clearly like a performance of gender, because the people who are actually out there fighting aren't the ones that are going to get to marry the princess. And you know, yeah, I think it's like I think there's a lot of layers to it, and I think that's one of the things I find really interesting about it. Yeah.
No, yeah, there was. I was just thinking back to that bit where they showed Jaws' victory acceptance, and they just have him like literally bench pressing the princess and her whole chair seat thing, which was I don't know. I find as much as I dislike Jaws, I also just love Jaws and how sometimes completely unself-awarely masked he is.
Yeah, I think what's interesting as well, and that was something I was thinking of before, and it kind of ties into what I just said, but as well too. But like, I think what's interesting too is the fact that, and again, I guess there's always like the argument to be made as to whether he is unaware but is making that kind of, you know, macho statement. But he refers to Cass and B as ladies when he refers to them. He like clearly, or is either being dismissive and is unaware, but like to my reading, if I feel like the straight in that he knows that these are a pair of women who are competing here, even if they may, and it kind of it does play into that idea, like I said, that idea of like the performance of gender, and what it sort of struck me as was that it kind of played into a bit that idea of like the whole, again, particularly like talking about like mid-century, that whole like Hollywood showbiz thing of like, we all know that this is our existence is something that we're putting on as a performance to the world as a general, but like between ourselves we can be whatever kind of thing.
While we're on the joust, this is going off in slightly a different direction, but I found it really interesting. It only struck me when we were talking about it just now, but the event that this sport, this competition is modeled on isn't kind of jousting in the medieval sense, it's the melee, and that's I just wonder if the I think Hannah Templar must either kind of like know a lot of medieval history or really done the research, because I just randomly kind of, I was listening to a YouTube video a couple of years ago, and I remember hearing that the melee was the bigger event, that jousting was a fairly kind of minor event, and it's the one that survived into modern consciousness, and kind of big groups of knights fighting each other until they were the last one standing, and like capturing other knights for, in the medieval case, for ransom. Like that was the main event, and so it's interesting that it's picked that up. I find that kind of cool, that like it's so accurately modeled on the medieval competition rather than our modern sense of the medieval competition.
Yeah, and this, I think, also definitely, like you were saying, I think this reflects some of Hannah Templar's own interests. Like, besides this comic, she's also, I don't know if she's writer on it, but she is the artist on the comics adaptation of the Netflix series Glow, Glamorous Ladies of Wrestling. So there's like a lot of her work kind of is in these kinds of spectacularized forms of combat that she comes back to a lot.
Cool, I didn't know that.
But right. I think that from there, I think one of the questions I wanted to bring up is in terms of bringing this setting and world over, like from like the way it's set up in the book to kind of how we might think about playing around with it, what we like and don't want, what we like and don't like, and what we want to bring over to like Thirsty Sword Lesbians, what might be more difficult. I was wondering, I guess I was wondering where people saw like the important things we need to bring over to kind of the feel here, and what we might not want to. And I guess I'll kind of go around in a circle here. David, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, it's an interesting one actually, because I think, and again, this goes back into sort of, I guess, the sort of discussion we're just having on the gender side of it. But what I find kind of interesting about this, like as it exists, and also I think is definitely something I'd want to kind of, both just in terms of like not just straight up following the arc of the comic kind of thing, is like this. The way that the characters go about this whole, like the idea of like the rescuing the princess sort of thing, because I think what I find really interesting in the comics is that there is this very, like, you can see both how it is obviously like that like conflict between the that's what I'm looking for, the societal position that these princesses are put in, and look back to our sort of thing where they are just treated as commodities, but Cass doesn't really treat them any differently. She wants to do something. She does something. You get this whole like, oh yeah, I'm taking them away and rescuing them, but also there's like obviously the person they're rescuing, like the second half of the first book, is that it's like, oh yeah, we had to drug her. And it's like, wait, are you actually rescuing these people, or are you just removing them from the situation they're in? Because those are not the same.
Yeah,
it's
and that's also
yeah.
That's also something I was interested in seeing more of in the second volume, because at least for the kind of preview of like the cover of it is does feature actually. Like, let me bring it up here. Like, we do actually see the princess of the first volume showing up as among the major characters. So I'm hoping we'll actually get to see more of her, as opposed to just kind of being another like victory for Cass. And how that might, and how that is, because I think that it's definitely pointing at what you were bringing up. So that was something I'm curious as well to see more in the book itself as well. But yeah, and what you were bringing up, I'm also sort of interested in seeing like, because there is also that question of like kind of symbolic acts of resistance and societal change that is also kind of hit upon, and I think is also an interesting thing to kind of play around with. But yeah, going around, Lyra, what about Lyra, sorry. What about you?
This is, I think that I'm super interested in what you, David, and Stephen's brought up, playing around with that and around the princesses. A couple of things one thing which occurred to me just is that you could, I'm not saying that we should, but you could run a game where everyone is a rescued princess, and whether some of them regard themselves as being rescued, some of them don't, and some of them may go into the same line of work as Cass and B, and that's one way you could get at the themes without kind of just replicating the plot. And that kind of brings me to a kind of more procedural question, I guess I was thinking, which is that there's kind of two very different categories of people. There are there are people who are knights or CosmoKnights, and there are people who aren't. And do we want to play where everyone is a CosmoKnight, when no one is a CosmoKnight, or when some people are CosmoKnights and some aren't? And I think that's kind of, that really kind of like, to me, is a really big question about how gameplay will go, like how that will actually look.
Yeah, and
I don't necessarily have an opinion on that, so throwing that out into the room, basically.
Yeah, and I definitely feel like there's going to need to be some kind of a bit more flexibility with how, like with how like kind of the like might be the word here. Because I guess one of the core assumptions of Thirsty Sword Lesbians is that everybody more or less can use a sword. Although that's also treated as a little bit even flexible in a few of the playbooks, because I think like the expansion playbooks, you have something like the Troubadour who can basically wield their art as if it were a weapon, but they don't actually have to wield it as a sword, which is interesting. But like, I feel like even in the core books, there's a possibility of kind of having flexibility to like how one fights. Like, I feel like there's not much mechanical difference within Thirsty Swords Lesbians other than like fictional positioning as to whether or not you were a Cosmo Knight when you get into a fight. And David, I think you I don't know, Lyra, how much you have played Cosmo, not Thirsty Sword Lesbians, but
I have never played Thirsty Sword Lesbians. It occurred to me just as I was starting this recording, I probably should have read it beforehand, but
that's okay.
But I didn't.
That's all right. Yeah, like I was worried because David, I know that you have run it, and I was wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, and I think it's interesting because I think one you know, I know I've said before that when I was running it, I love Thirsty Sword Lesbians. It's a good game. I think the title is very good for what it does and for the reactions it provoked. I think it's an awful title for the game, and I wish they'd chosen something different. And yeah, and I think this kind of touches both the point you were just making touched on the fact that, yeah, you know, there's the whole like sword thing. It's like, yeah, and I don't think it has to. It's like, obviously, like looking at CosmoKnights and Thirsty Sword Lesbians together, the obvious thing is to go, well, obviously everyone's going to be playing a knight because you're going to be out there fighting in a you know, fighting duels, fighting jousts in your big armor suits and all of that. And that makes sense, obviously, within the context of Thirsty Sword Lesbians, because that is kind of, you're fighting with swords, essentially, even if you may also have like rocket launchers or whatever. But on the other hand, you also have the fact that, yeah, you know, Thirsty Sword Lesbians does not require you necessarily to be fighting with swords. I mean, you know, you could be thirsty gunslinging lesbians or, you know, whatever, and that would also work. There's no real, because the actual like combat side of things is so like mechanically, it's so like led by the fiction that, the difference between you fighting with swords or fighting with 6-shooters or like firing with like interplanetary artillery at each other doesn't matter. You know, it's like it's the conflict that's important rather than the mechanics of it. And I think that's one aspect of it. From the other hand, obviously the interesting thing with CosmoKnights, like kind of we touched on earlier, is that it's also like it's assumed to like the jousts are assumed to be a very male sphere. So that also then brings in as to whether, and again, this is something that's like brought up within the rule book of Thirsty Sword Lesbians itself. It's like whether we're looking at playing, obviously, if we're like looking at playing a princess, that's all very female gendered and stuff. If we're looking more at the CosmoKnights, that is more male gendered, and it's whether we just look at more queering those identities as a whole in general, where we want to like focus that lens, and all that sort of stuff, really. So yeah, that was a lot of words, but yeah, I think it's I think where we choose, and I say lines, I mean, it doesn't have to be lines, you know, it can be messy and permeable and all that. But I think, yeah, what bits we focus on is going to be interesting when it comes to that.
Yeah. Incidentally, Thirsty Gunslinging Lesbians was actually my other thought for books to pair with Thirsty Sword Lesbians, because I was also looking at Sarah Gailey's Upright Women Wanted, which is about which is sort of a post-apocalyptic all women Western. So that was happy that you brought that up, David. But yeah, I guess the other question that was kind of I was kind of thinking through here was to kind of how to how to work around the kind of assumption that the book makes, and it again depends on how we want to draw it in, is that there is a kind of spectacularized, ritualized element to combat in the world. That there are events where combat takes place that are as much for winning the hand as they are for entertainment. And so I was kind of thinking through, is there an expansion to the dueling rules we'd want to make that might reflect I don't know, something like Worldwide Wrestling's the fact that you also have an audience you want to please, or things like that. Or maybe this could just be that when you fight, are you fighting to please the crowd, or are you fighting to win? And you might be able to entice the crowd or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's cool. And I think again, it's been a few months since I last looked at the rules for Thirsty Sword Lesbians. But yeah, I feel like the way it handles combat does play quite nicely into that already, because you do have the fact that the kind of, it isn't assumed that your goal in fighting with somebody is to do them damage, and
Yeah.
you know, and I think that fits in nicely with this idea of combat as ritual, because yeah, you can look to achieve things other than just beating up your opponent. I think that I feel like that fits. Like I said, yeah, there may be some tweaks we add to it, but I feel like just as it stands, I feel like that's already a fairly good fit between the mechanics, at least my memory of the mechanics, and that idea.
Yeah, I was thinking through of because in my head I was just thinking through of how I fit these characters into roles in the game, because I feel like there's a clear, I mean, Kate is obviously a trickster, and I kind of want to just be weird and assign Cass the troubadour, because really her art is just being really good at fighting. But yeah, I was and Pan was, I was kind of torn on. Is she just a really innocent swashbuckler, or is she a nature witch? Because I do kind of feel like Pan's thing is falling for everyone she meets, and getting madly blushy around everyone.
I was going to say, you can see the point in every panel where I would be calling for a
Yes.
for the smitten thing. Yeah.
But yeah, those were I think a lot of the questions that I had. I wonder if any of you had any other kind of questions you wanted to throw out to the group. Otherwise, I feel like, as I said, this was going to be a shorter session, and we are going to be having Puckett join us next week, and hopefully, I'm gonna get in contact with Nate. I haven't heard from Nate, so it's possible that Nate just is going to be a no-show. I don't know. But yeah. Do any of you folks have any questions you wanted to throw out?
I guess I was thinking about kind of the ritualized conflict versus kind of other conflict. Although it's hinted at, there's kind of like there's not. I don't think there's any actual violence in this comic that isn't in the joust. I think there's kind of, it's implied, but I don't think it's there, and kind of how we would want to kind of play that in our game. Like, is all combat ritualized, or is the kind of two tiers, kind of ritualized combat and other conflicts that are obviously implied in the
there is a gunfight. There is one gunfight where Kate shoots at them.
Yeah. So there is. Yeah.
But yeah, it is like very rare. And even in that one, I think the reason you're kind of not thinking of it was probably that it is like a combat that does not end with anyone hurt. It just ends with some narrative fallout for the characters. Which is, I think, an interesting thing to bring up there. That there is sort of like outside of the joust, nobody actually like gets injured as a result of the violence. That seems to be about the only place where we actually see kind of violence escalating to that level.
Yeah, there's a kind of implied threat of violence from the cops to Pan's dad, but that kind of, he acquiesces, and that doesn't go further. So yeah, it is very kind of implied, apart from in the joust.
Yeah.
That actually reminds me, which is an entire digression, but just what we were speaking about earlier about the whole idea of the class and how the worlds work and stuff. Well, it is interesting. Like I said, yeah, you do have this whole thing where it's like known that Pan was responsible for Tara. Tara? Anyway, fleeing the planet. But there doesn't, aside from like social ostracization or whatever, there doesn't appear to have been any like it's not like they've been sent to the tower for being treasonous or whatever. It's just, the family left, and people don't like her now. But yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. But in terms of like the stuff that for in terms of the game, like I said, I think there's nothing else I think particularly. I think there's some stuff that would be interesting to like talk about and find out, like as we do our kind of like getting set up and choosing who we are and those sort of things. Because it is interesting, but like we do have obviously this idea of, you obviously have these like powerful mobile suits that people fight in, but we don't really hear about any wars between different planets or whatever. It seems to be, again, from the little information that's been given so far, it seems to be a largely peaceful existence outside of these duels. So I think that is interesting, and it might be interesting to play about that and see where we go with that. But yeah,
there is some implication of piracy, and
at
the very start of the second volume, B declares, "Well, we're clearly not going to be attacked by pirates because we're not a good target." And I feel like that's just like, oh, so you're clearly going to be attacked by pirates at some point.
Yeah.
I guess there's enough demand for a kind of no questions asked kind of informal clinic that I suppose that could be a number of things.
Yeah,
but
it's
like,
also a free clinic is the thing that it is. Yeah,
so I guess that doesn't necessarily imply kind of the injuries that were treated as a result of violence, but it's kind of interesting how much is left to like implication or assumption about the world as a whole. Kind of like it's painted with a very light brush, and this is really interesting.
Yeah, and I think certainly part of that is because it is a comic, and there's a lot less space to deliver information in a comic than there is in like a novel, which is I'm not criticizing it for being a comic. It's just a reality of like you get a lot fewer words per page.
Yeah, in some ways you get way more information
Yeah.
with the visual stuff, but it's kind
Yeah.
of it's trading one type of kind of storytelling for another, really.
But yeah, yeah. So, and that brings us, I think, to well, I think the last few things are really just some procedural questions. So I think I will be taking us off recording now, and thanks anyone who is watching this, watching three folks discuss a comic. Have a good evening, all, or morning, or whatever time it is. I don't know why I said evening, because it is actually morning where I am, but I guess I'm just already taking our UK residents perspective here.